Picture this. You're standing in the drafty hall of a Scottish manor house in the year 1367 AD, and you're watching your older sister, barely 16, trembling in her wedding dress. The ceremony ended hours ago, but instead of leaving with her new husband toward their modest cottage, she's being led up the stone staircase by the lord of the manor himself. Your brother-in-law, the groom, stands frozen at the bottom of those stairs, his face a mask of rage and helplessness. Everyone in the hall knows what's about to happen. The Lord is exercising his right, a privilege that's whispered about in every peasant household, feared by every bride, and accepted by every community as the price of living on noble land. But here's the question that historians have debated for centuries. Did this rite of the first night actually exist? And if it did, what was it really like for the women who had no choice but to submit? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't a clear-cut tale of documented horror. It's something more complex and perhaps more disturbing. A story of rights that existed in legal gray areas, of violations that were sometimes recorded as taxes, of a practice so normalized that its very existence is now debated by scholars. The droit du seigneur, or right of the Lord, represents one of history's most controversial questions. Did feudal lords really claim the right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding nights? Or is this just medieval propaganda, a myth created to make the nobility look worse than they were? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. And it's far more disturbing than either simple answer would suggest. Let's start with what we know for certain. In medieval Europe, from roughly 1200 to 1600 AD, feudal lords held almost absolute power over the peasants who worked their land. These weren't just landlords in the modern sense. They controlled every aspect of peasant life, who could marry, who could move away, who could learn a trade, even who could gather firewood in the forest. Peasants weren't quite slaves, but they weren't free either. They were bound to the land, and the land was bound to the lord. Within this system, marriage required the lord's permission. A peasant couldn't simply decide to marry and set up a household. The couple had to petition the lord, often paying a fee for the privilege. These fees were documented extensively in manor records across Europe. In England, they were called merchet. In France, for mariage. In Scotland, marchetta mulierum. The records are clear and abundant. Thousands of documents show peasants paying for permission to marry. But here's where things get complicated and deeply disturbing. Some of these documents don't just record a simple monetary payment. They record something else, a fee paid specifically to avoid the lord's carnal rights over the bride. Let me be very clear about what this means. These weren't metaphorical rights. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were documented instances of lords claiming sexual access to peasant women and peasants paying money to prevent it from happening. The most famous example comes from Scotland. In 1298 AD, William Wallace, the legendary Scottish rebel, issued a declaration that included language explicitly abolishing the marchetta, which he described as the lord's right to lie with any bride of his tenants on her wedding night. Now, Wallace wasn't exactly an objective historian. He was trying to rally Scots against English rule, and painting English lords as rapists was effective propaganda. But here's the thing. You don't create propaganda about a practice that doesn't exist at all. The most effective lies are built on recognizable truths. Records from France are even more explicit. A document from 1419 AD, preserved in the archives of Amiens, details a dispute between the abbot of Saint Germain and several peasant families. The peasants claimed they had paid the traditional fee to avoid the abbot's jus primae noctis, the right of the first night. But the abbot's representative argued that the payment was insufficient and demanded either additional payment or compliance with the traditional right. The case went to a regional court, which eventually ruled that the abbot's claim was consistent with ancient custom, but that the peasants Payment should be accepted as sufficient. Let that sink in for a moment. A medieval court, in a recorded and preserved legal document, acknowledged as ancient custom that a church official claimed the right to sexually violate peasant brides unless they paid enough money to prevent it. But you might be thinking, maybe these were just corrupt individuals, not a widespread practice. Maybe these were exceptions, outliers, the medieval equivalent of criminal behavior. That's what many historians argued for centuries. They claimed the droit du seigneur was a myth created by Enlightenment thinkers who wanted to make the feudal system look worse than it actually was. And there's some truth to that argument. Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, wrote extensively about the droit du seigneur in the 1760s, using it as evidence that the old feudal system was barbaric and needed to be overthrown. He may have exaggerated its frequency and prominence, but exaggeration isn't the same as invention. The challenge for historians is determining where reality ends and propaganda begins. Here's what we can piece together from multiple sources across different regions and time periods. The right existed in various forms with different names across much of feudal Europe. In some places, it was primarily symbolic. A lord might claim the right to sit beside the bride at the wedding feast, or to receive the first dance, or to be given a portion of the wedding dinner. These symbolic gestures reinforced the lord's authority without involving actual sexual contact. But in other places, and this is the disturbing part, the symbolic gradually became literal. Or perhaps it was literal from the start and only later became symbolic as social attitudes shifted. The documentation is inconsistent, varying by region, time period, and individual lord. What's clear is that many lords claimed some form of privileged access to peasant brides, and that peasants paid to avoid whatever that access entailed. Let's step inside one of these transactions and try to understand what it meant for the people involved. Picture yourself as a young woman in rural France around 1450 AD. You're 17 years old, which means you're at the perfect age for marriage. You've been courting Pierre, a farmer's son from the next village, for 2 years now. Your families have agreed to the match. Pierre's family will give your family a pig and some chickens. Your family will provide linens and cooking pots. It's a modest arrangement, but it represents security and the possibility of building a life together. But before any of this can happen, before the priest can say the words that bind you together, Pierre's father has to petition the Lord for permission. This isn't unusual. Everyone does it. The fee is typically a few days' wages for a laborer, more than your family would like to spend, but manageable. Pierre's father makes the journey to the manor house, prepared to negotiate. What happens next depends entirely on which lord controls your land. If you're lucky, the lord simply accepts the standard fee and grants permission. The steward makes a note in the manor records. Pierre, son of Jean, granted permission to marry Marie as daughter of Robert upon payment of standard merchet fee. And that's the end of it. You marry, move into your cottage, and begin your life together. But if you're unlucky, the steward looks at the records and notes that this is your family's first daughter to marry. First daughters, the steward explains to Pierre's father, are subject to the Lord's traditional rights. Pierre's father knows what this means. Everyone knows what this means. The standard fee won't be enough. There are two options: pay a much higher fee, often 10 times the standard amount, or comply with the Lord's ancient right to spend the wedding night with the bride. Pierre's father returns to the village and explains the situation. Both families are thrown into turmoil. 10 times the standard fee is impossible. It represents months of income, money they simply don't have. The alternative is unthinkable, but it has to be considered. Some families in this situation simply accept it. They tell themselves it's just one night, that it doesn't really count, that it's the price of living on noble land. They convince themselves that the bride will recover, that the marriage will proceed as planned, that life will go on. Other families try to resist. They petition the local church, hoping that religious authority will override feudal custom. Sometimes this works. A sympathetic priest might intervene, arguing that the practice violates Christian marriage vows. But more often, the church sides with the Lord. After all, many lords are also church officials. Abbots and bishops held feudal territories just like secular nobles. They had the same economic incentives to maintain their privileges. Some families try to escape. They flee to a city where different laws apply. Medieval cities offered more freedom than rural areas, and city air, as the saying went, makes you free. But fleeing means giving up everything: your land, your home, your extended family, your entire way of life. Most people aren't willing to pay that price. So what happens to you, the bride, in this scenario? You have no legal say in any of these decisions. Under feudal law, you're not really a person with rights. You're a dependent of your father until marriage, and then a dependent of your husband. Your feelings about being handed over to the Lord for a night don't matter legally. They might matter to your family personally, but that's not the same thing. Let's say your family decides to comply. What does that actually mean in practice? The documents don't provide details, and for good reason. These were transactions that everyone involved wanted to forget as quickly as possible. But we can infer some things from related historical records and from the few personal accounts that do survive. The tradition typically worked like this. After the wedding ceremony, the bride would be taken to the manor house instead of returning home with her husband. She might be accompanied by female relatives or servants, or she might be taken alone. The Lord would exercise his right, however he chose to define it. This might mean simply spending time in a room together, or it might mean actual sexual intercourse. The assumption, based on the high fees paid to avoid this ritual, is that it usually meant the latter. The next morning, the bride would return to her husband. The marriage would be consummated, assuming it hadn't been the previous night, and life would continue. The community would treat the whole event as if it never happened. It would never be spoken of directly. The children born from the marriage would be treated as the husband's children, regardless of biological paternity. The entire system depended on a conspiracy of silence. But what was this experience like for the women involved? Here's where we have to rely heavily on inference, because medieval peasant women rarely left written records. We can look at descriptions of similar situations like the documented cases of lords forcing themselves on servant women, which were occasionally prosecuted in medieval courts. The patterns are consistent: violence, threats, physical restraint, and psychological trauma that lasted for years. One of the few direct accounts comes from a 1486 AD court case in Burgundy. A woman named John testified that the local lord had demanded his ancient right when she married. Her father had paid what he thought was sufficient to avoid it, but the lord claimed the payment was inadequate. Jean testified that she was taken to the manor house, held by servants while the lord had his way, and then returned to her husband the next morning. She became pregnant shortly after and gave birth to a daughter who looked nothing like her husband. The lord refused to acknowledge any responsibility. Jean's husband eventually left her, unable to accept the constant reminder of what had happened. This case only came to court because the lord later tried to claim the same right over Jean's younger sister, and the family decided to fight. The court's ruling was telling. They acknowledged that the lord had ancient custom on his side, but ruled that the original payment should have been sufficient, and that exercising the right after payment had been made constituted theft, not rape, not assault, theft, because the crime, in the court's view, was not the violation of Jean's body, but the violation of the financial transaction. The more you dig into the historical record, the clearer it becomes that whether the droit du seigneur was real depends entirely on how you define real. Was it a universal, legally codified right that every lord could exercise at any time? No. There's no evidence of any European law that explicitly granted this right in legal code. Was it a practice that occurred with some regularity in certain places at certain times, justified by appeals to ancient custom and enforced through the lord's overwhelming power over peasant life? Yes, the evidence for that is undeniable. The practice seems to have been most common in regions where feudal power was strongest and most unchecked. In England, where royal authority and common law provided some limits on noble power, references to the practice are rare and mostly symbolic. In Scotland, France, and parts of Germany, where individual nobles held more autonomous power, the evidence is more substantial. In Eastern Europe, where serfdom was even more oppressive than in the West, similar practices persisted even longer. What finally ended the practice, or the perception of the practice, was the gradual erosion of feudal power itself. As cities grew, as trade expanded, as centralized royal authority increased, the absolute power of local lords decreased. Peasants gained more legal rights and more economic options. The ability to move to a city or work for wages meant that lords couldn't simply do whatever they wanted without consequence. The practices that had been justified by ancient custom came to be seen as barbaric remnants of a dying system. But here's what's really disturbing about this entire history. It took until the 1700s for European intellectuals to start widely condemning the practice. For centuries, it was simply accepted as part of how the world worked. Writers who documented medieval life mentioned it the way they might mention harvest festivals or market days, as just another aspect of feudal custom. The idea that it was wrong, that it violated something fundamental about human dignity, came slowly and late. And even today, the historical debate continues. Some historians argue that the entire concept was a myth created by later generations to discredit feudalism. They point to the lack of explicit legal codification, the reliance on indirect evidence, and the possibility that documents were forged or misunderstood. Other historians argue that the evidence, while circumstantial, is too extensive and too consistent to dismiss. They point to the payment records, the court cases, the explicit descriptions in legal disputes, and the references in literature and chronicles. The truth, as uncomfortable as it is probably this. The droit du seigneur existed as a practice in some places at some times, justified by ancient custom rather than formal law. It was probably more common in earlier medieval periods and became less common as feudal power weakened. It was probably more sexual in nature in some regions and more symbolic in others. And it was probably underreported in historical records because everyone involved had reasons to keep quiet about it. For the women who experienced it, whether it was called droit du seigneur or marché or marchetta or some other name, the label didn't matter. What mattered was the reality, that on what should have been one of the happiest days of their lives, they were subjected to the will of a man who had power over them, and that they had no legal recourse, no ability to refuse, and no acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. The wedding night is supposed to be about love, about commitment, about two people choosing to build a life together. For countless medieval women, it was about something else entirely. It was about power, about ownership, about the casual cruelty of a system that treated human beings as property. We don't know how many women experienced this. We don't know their names or their stories. We know that some paid to avoid it, which means they knew it was real enough to fear. We know that some couldn't pay, which means they had no choice but to submit. We know that the system that allowed this to happen persisted for centuries, accepted by communities that should have known better. The droit du seigneur, real or exaggerated, documented or mythologized, stands as a reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute vulnerability. It's a reminder that the most fundamental violations of human dignity are often the ones that get wrapped in legal language, justified by tradition, and hidden in the gray areas of historical record. The next time you hear someone romanticize medieval times, the next time someone talks about the honor and chivalry of feudal society, remember the brides who paid fees to avoid their lord's rights. Remember the women whose wedding nights were stolen from them. Remember that behind every great castle and every romantic tale of knights and ladies, there were countless people with no power, no choice, and no voice in history. Their silence echoes across the centuries, a reminder that the price of unchecked power is always paid by those who have the least. If you found this exploration of forgotten history as fascinating and disturbing as I did, please let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And what other dark corners of history should we explore together? Your engagement helps more people discover these important stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.